Just wanted to start with an acknowledgement. Evergreen's Olympia campus is located on the territories of the Medicine Creek Treaty Tribes, which includes the Squaxin Island Tribe, the Nisqually, and the Puyallup Tribes. The Squaxin Islands Tribe's habitation of the land on and around the inlets of the Southern Salish Sea, where we are right now, including what is the city of Olympia and Evergreen State College, spans thousands of years. Treaty rights established and fought for by tribes are now experiencing new challenges posed by climate change. So a lot of the lectures we heard about in this lecture series brought attention to these issues. And to learn more, I really encourage you all to check out the Native Cases collection online. It's a series of case studies about Native issues, and many are about climate change and treaty rights. And Olympia's Hidden Histories, which is a really cool guided tour of downtown Olympia that sort of reveals some of the socio-natural histories of Olympia and brings us into touch with that history. Also wanted to say thank you to Evergreen's Media Services for helping us record this event and preserve it so that we might be able to distribute these recordings later on. And thanks, of course, to our guests, Dr. Jen Rice and Dr. Josh Long, for making the long trek here from Georgia and Texas. So we're really grateful for having you guys here. Josh Long is a professor of environmental studies at Southwestern University in Georgetown, Texas. That's just north of Austin, I believe. His research interests include climate justice, critical sustainability, urban studies, and environmental justice. Much of his current work focuses on climate justice issues as they relate to the displacement and exploitation of vulnerable populations during the climate crisis that we're experiencing right now. Jen Rice is an associate professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Georgia. She is an urban geographer interested in concrete strategies for social and environmental justice. Her longest project has focused on urban climate justice and resisting climate apartheid, specifically focusing on the city of Seattle. She also examines housing justice and its relationship with climate change and racial justice in the wake of broader settler colonial urbanization patterns. Their talk today is called Climate Coloniality. I'm going to hand it off to them and just say thank you, and let's welcome them with a round of applause. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Anthony. I really appreciate it, and we really appreciate y'all. Thank you so much for letting us be here today. I know that I speak on behalf of Dr. Rice when I say we are excited to be at Evergreen. This is a very different atmosphere than the universities we normally teach at. She teaches at the University of Georgia, red campus, red state. And while I teach blue campus in a red state, that red state is a big one. and you can feel its pressures there all the time. And so thank you for allowing us to be here and speak on this. By the way, I should say, we never really know what to expect from our audience or from the students who attend or colleagues who attend our lecture. So please ask questions, make comments. If you want to be critical, that's great. Let's talk about it. If you want to ask tough questions. We are here for that kind of content. So I should also say, covering some challenging themes, including some imagery that might be a little bit challenging for some audience members. So I'm just throwing that out there. I mean, we are talking about the horrible atrocities of colonialism. So there's some gross stuff in there. So be prepared for that. And it's a lot to deal with because there's a lot going on right now. I mean, we barely have time to process the multiple crises that punctuate our everyday existence. Climate crisis, COVID crisis, opioid crisis, student debt crisis, you get the point. There's a lot going on. But at times like this, we have to remember that historically speaking, periods of crisis are the times when contradictions of unsustainable systems are most exposed and most vulnerable for intervention. And they force us to relearn sort of those whitewash histories and question those stubborn ideologies that remain in our culture. In fact, right now we're living through one of these moments where people all over the world, including, I would say, you, of course, right here in this classroom, are questioning the validity of our political and economic systems and how they brought us here. So today we're going to talk a little bit about some of these structures that underlie our everyday crisis-infused existence. In particular, we're going to talk about the ways that we're asked to conform to a specific colonialist logic of citizenship, and how that mentality facilitates the reproduction of capitalist growth and colonialism for the era of climate change. These are important because we need to understand the causes of the climate crisis, but just as importantly, we need to understand how systems like colonialism and capitalism perpetuate those crises and even manifest in our climate solutions. That's essentially the main focus of our talk today. Dr. Rice and I will talk about some of the different ways that a colonialist logic reinforces an unjust system of planetary exploitation and environmental degradation. I'll discuss this example on a global scale with some examples, and then I'll turn it over to Dr. Rice, and she'll discuss sort of the seemingly mundane, but very pervasive processes that reinforce this logic and how these processes are rendered invisible by our everyday experiences as citizens in a settler colonial state. To really explain this, we do have to cover some of the historical patterns and processes of colonialism. So let's get started. First, let's remember that all forms of colonialism require the establishment of social hierarchies. Colonizers exploit societal divisions or create entirely new hierarchies. And historically, these were based in ideas of racial purity, eugenics, and to a lesser degree, title. These divisions were used to segregate specialized labor pools, and there was almost always a spatial element to this mode of segregation. Whether we're talking about the Spanish encomienda system, which was based almost entirely on race, or whether we're talking about the strategic movement of Indian labor pools under the British Raj, the complexities of the French colonial estate system, or any of the other colonial racial hierarchies, these systems establish a clear ranking that stated some members of society are more valued than others. And many of these legacies still remain in all post-colonial societies, as do the scars of spatial segregation. They can be seen in French colonial cities, where we still see much of the division in cities that were originally based on race and perceived health needs, the sort of French cordon sanitaire, or as a remnant of South African apartheid, where the legacies of segregation remain deeply entrenched still in the landscape. Sometimes existing divisions were exploited, like in the British appropriation of the caste system. But other times, divisions were reinscribed to adhere to a Eurocentric colonial worldview of the colonized population. The idea of the noble savage, for instance, was ascribed to native populations that were considered redeemable in order to divide into who was and who wasn't, and who was also useful in furthering colonial aims, all constructions created from a Eurocentric point of view. Second, we have to remember that the acts of colonialism are so horrific that they require a specific narrative to justify their acts. It's often rooted in these notions of civilization versus barbarism, and usually included elements of the divine. And if you have the divine on your side, then what could go wrong? And like I said, there's some pretty brutal imagery here, and we forget just how blatant the racism and colonial suppression was. Each nation had their own version of these same narratives, including the white man's burden, or the scramble for Africa, which not only glorified the, quote, salvation of Africa for the sake of the Africans, but also created a sense of survivalism among European powers themselves, because they were so concerned that if they did not continue their own forms of colonialism, it would weaken their own power back in continental Europe. Always this racist narrative includes justifications for resource extraction and wealth creation. The guy on the right here, Cecil Rhodes, of course, believed that the British are the finest race of people in the world, and that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. What a guy. He also contended that his overwhelming theft of diamonds and gold was not only good for the African population because it gave them a role in building British civilization, but, and this is key, it was important because he believed it was his legal right under British law. This weaving of racial superiority and civilization, capitalist exploitation, and superimposed legal codes never went away. We can still see them in the landscape today. We can certainly see it in US history, as we built upon colonizer traditions and our own cultural lens of indigenous oppression to impose hierarchies among different tribes, such as the designation of the, quote, 5 civilized tribes, alongside the active displacement of native populations in the commodification and sale of native land. Not to mention, of course, the narrative of manifest destiny, which married the rhetoric of salvation, civilization, progress, and capitalism to justify a violent conquest but also, of course, the commodification of a continent. Of course, once colonizer culture has become the dominant culture, indoctrination becomes the norm, as institutions like schools and churches attempt to force assimilation on target populations while advancing a narrative of racial superiority amongst all members of the population. They are also advancing a narrative of racial superiority amongst those that are conquested, but also that exist in the current dominant culture, suggesting that conquest, commodification, and industry were not only morally good, but divinely inspired. Furthermore, these racialized narratives are enshrined in statues and documents that whitewash histories of conquest with myths of salvation and replace the violence of these processes with a veneer of cooperation and humanitarianism. If you want some stories later about this, I can tell you about how these things are still, these sort of like propaganda tools are still taken very much for history. I can give you some fun anecdotes from my own university at home. The thing is, these legacies of settler colonialism remain in the landscape, and they're applied to processes that can cause direct harm to the environment and the public, such as when fossil fuel extraction on native land is marketed as a way to create wealth and employment. These stick around in our institutions and even our ideological approach to development. Researchers like myself and Dr. Rice are very interested in the ways that colonialist logic can be seen in mainstream climate action. I'm going to discuss how these legacies of colonialism, in concert with market-driven capitalism, have become so commonplace we don't even really recognize them anymore. But before I do, I should probably define what we mean by climate coloniality, and for that matter, what we mean by mainstream climate action. So we keep talking about climate colonialism. Climate colonialism notes that the geopolitical and economic systems advanced by colonizer countries have both created the current climate crisis, and they've defined the conversations about climate solutions, and that's what's key. And so this process about defining climate solutions comes up in studies of climate coloniality, which broadly refers to the reproduction of colonialist power relations and ideologies via climate change, with particular emphasis on how proposed climate actions benefit the global north at the expense of the global south. Now, by mainstream climate action, I'm referring to the global move towards market-based, capitalist approaches that prioritize large-scale, technological, and expert-driven solutions to climate change. You see, for the past decade, and especially after the Paris Agreement, a new market opened up for new products and programs that encourage investment, research and development, and collaborative partnerships to solve climate change. The narrative that has stuck has been very, very stubborn, and it's stayed on brand. With enough investment, technological innovation, and political willpower, climate change is solvable. That narrative is used to sort of mask the incredibly profit-driven nature of these programs. Because in this mindset, climate change is not only a challenge that can be solved by, quote, the best and the brightest, but it's also eminently profitable. As the leader of BlackRock, once the world's largest investor in fossil fuels, recently noted, climate change is real and cannot be ignored by investors. We see climate change and the green transition as persistent drivers of asset returns and consequently fundamental to making strategic investment decisions. And when they were accused of being too woke, the CEO, Larry Fink, actually said, oh, no, we're not woke. We focus on sustainability not because we're environmentalists. We focus on it because we're capitalists. We've entered a period when private investors and banks are partnering with the world's largest development agencies like the World Bank, the United Nations, in order to find and fund bankable projects, largely in the developing world, that can ensure a profitable return on investment. Such major projects require the financial infrastructure, such as major banks and intermediaries, which are almost all exclusively headquartered in the global north, and mechanisms, such as climate bonds, in order to fund these projects. This is the model that has become the norm. Mainstreaming climate action means simplifying the climate crisis with ambiguous terms like climate resilient or climate conscious or climate friendly. And this is also key, very simplified metrics, such as just carbon or emissions reduction, overlooking some of the injustices that are perpetrated in its wake. Climate change became an urgent rallying cry in a time of crisis, a justifying narrative for all kinds of actions, particularly those profitable solutions. Unregulated capitalism thrives in this kind of crisis environment. Technological innovation is investable, large-scale mitigation projects are profitable, and greenwash spectacles make excellent marketing tools for a very superficial message of progress. They also require a steady supply of minerals, materials, and other supplies to ensure production levels. But even more, they need vast amounts of land and water. Infringement on native lands for renewable energy projects or for access to resources has led to this displacement of vulnerable communities throughout the world, and there's serious concern that this will dramatically increase. Why? Because indigenous populations account for approximately 5% of the world's population, but they protect approximately 75% of the world's biodiversity and about 20% of the world's stored carbon in forest ecosystems. A recent study in Nature Sustainability identified more than 5,000 mining projects involving about 30 minerals needed in the energy transition. Over half of them were located either on or immediately adjacent to indigenous people's lands. It also found that approximately 85% of the world's lithium reserves, which we are seeing an incredibly spiked demand in, 85% overlap with indigenous lands. And while we're talking about extracting minerals for renewable energy and other climate mitigation technologies, we have to remind you that this is not a new pattern that's just new to renewable energy production. This displacement of indigenous populations and the theft of indigenous lands has always accompanied the history of resource extraction. In the US, native peoples and lands continue to be targeted for, say, coal and uranium mining in the Navajo Nation, copper, fossil fuel, and uranium mining in Bears Ears, the displacement of native populations for the building of dams and reservoirs, pipeline construction on native land like the Dakota Access Pipeline, the disposal of toxic and radioactive materials on native land such as the Navajo and Hopi nations. The point is, these are ongoing fights today for native sovereignty. This is not ancient history. So at this point, the similarities between historical colonialism and contemporary climate colonialism are probably fairly evident. And while some of this happens at a national or international scale, other forms of climate coloniality are normalized through our everyday experiences in our day-to-day life. And that's exactly what Dr. Rice is going to talk about. Cities, towns, and even college campuses are susceptible to colonial logic. And in some ways, so are all of us, because we're locked into this path-dependent system, not of our own design. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rice here. But before I do, I want to make a quick qualification. Neither one of us are against climate mitigation or climate adaptation or any climate action that actually takes real, serious, just solutions. Instead, we want to point out the contradictions evident in a message that states climate solutions done in the name of profit and wealth are the only pathway to that solution. In fact, there's myriad climate solutions that promote justice, equity, and equality. These solutions aim to dismantle rather than reproduce those systems of oppression that lead us into this ongoing era of crisis. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Rice.
All right, thank you, Josh. Okay, good to see you all. I'm so happy to be here. I know Dr. Long already said that, but I'll say it again. So Dr. Long just spoke of a general, global, and crisis-driven form of climate coloniality. I want to switch gears to look at the everyday, mundane, almost invisible ways in which coloniality is reproduced in urban climate action. This work, which is led by my PhD student, Maya Henderson, who deserves a huge shout out, takes climate action in the settler colonial city as the point of analysis. Our project draws on my long-term research on climate governance and carbon gentrification in Seattle, and Maya's interest in settler colonial cities and indigenous sovereignty. Together, our analysis highlights how colonial logics continue on in various ways, in this case through urban climate governance. Our goal is to think critically about what constrains efforts for true climate justice in our cities by looking at what's happening in Seattle, a leader in climate action. So first, we should start with a quick review of Seattle's settler colonial past and present, something I assume some or many of you might be familiar with by living in the region. It's perhaps best exemplified by this statue in downtown Seattle, a statue of Chief Cecil, or as he's more commonly called, Chief Seattle. The plaque on the statue reads, quote, "Seattle, Chief of the Squamish, a firm friend of the whites. For him, the city of Seattle was named by its founders, 1801. This is like right downtown Seattle. This mirrors the dominant narrative about the city, a town created by settlers with willing and friendly native participants. As some of you probably know, Seattle occupies the lands of the Jawamish and Squamish peoples. In 1851, the Denny Party arrived at Alki Point, which is described as having, quote, crying women, threatening skies, and strange Indians, end quote, creating a triumphant story for the settlers. Crucial to this was the signing of the Treaty of Point Elliott in 1855, not really all that long ago. But like most treaties, it was immediately violated by settlers. Despite this, Seattle purports to be on, quote, ceded ground that belongs to everyone, which works to naturalize the settler presence and evade accountability. Seattle proudly promotes an image as a city in good relation with Indigenous people, a city of good urban settlers. In fact, Seattle refers to its Indigenous roots in many visible ways. Seen here, totem poles can be found throughout Seattle, though based on our research, tribes from the region did not originally practice this craft. The city of Seattle's logo up there on the top right is obviously a profile of an Indigenous person in a native headdress, and native style art can be seen throughout the city. Yet today, this is a presenter view. Yet today, the demographic makeup of the city is very much driven by its recent technological boom. Largely due to technology giant Amazon, Seattle is increasingly a city of mostly white and Asian, highly educated and affluent citizens that are attracted to the city as young, creative tech workers. Starting salaries for workers at Amazon's downtown corporate headquarters are well over $100,000. And the median household income has doubled in the city since 2000. This has contributed to significant waves of gentrification and displacement among lower income and Black residents. At the same time, Native people make up only 0.5% of the city's residents, but 6% of the city's unhoused population. Seattle's reputation as a leader on climate action is a large part of why Amazon chose Seattle for its headquarters. Starting in the 1990s, Seattle crafted several climate change mitigation action plans and strategies. They have also declared their intentions of being a carbon neutral city by 2050. Young, affluent tech workers are drawn to these characteristics as they enjoy the city's investments in alternative transit, walkable neighborhoods, and green buildings. There is nothing more conspicuous to exemplify this context than this downtown landmark, the Climate Pledge Arena. It's the newly renovated Key Arena. Right downtown near the Space Needle. Amazon named the arena after their corporate program. Amazon named it after their corporate program that promotes reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2040. The Climate Pledge Arena boasts that it is, quote, the first net zero carbon certified arena in the world, powered by 100% renewable energy, end quote. So if Indigenous peoples are represented as Seattle's past on the landscape, then the Climate Pledge Arena is a symbol of Seattle's future. A leading climate-friendly city catering to a population of largely white, young, and affluent tech workers. Through narratives of ceded land, carbon neutrality, and universal climate leadership, Seattle, as a settler colonial city, aims to define what it means to be a green city. So amidst this very complex past and present, we ask, how are Seattle's climate mitigation policies enrolled in the ongoing process of settler colonial dispossession and displacement? Our foundational understanding of the settler colonial city is trifold and closely linked to what Dr. Long just spoke about. First, a settler colonial city like Seattle is, of course, founded on stolen Indigenous land. This required violent and forced dispossession and attempted eradication of Native peoples. Second, the process is ongoing. Initial Native dispossession is followed by subsequent waves of displacement of Native peoples, as well as other racialized and marginalized groups. And finally, maintenance of the settler colonial city requires the naturalization of capitalism, private property relations, and private ownership as an untouchable right for and in the service of settlers. Policies and programs and actions in the settler colonial city, we argue, are tied to a settler logic. These are anchored in Western and modernist ways of thinking. As the left side of the table shows, this includes the importance of private property, commodification of everything, individualistic and dominating actions, systems thinking about problems and solutions, as well as knowledge silos and dichotomy, either or thinking. These promote solutions that are falsely objective and rely heavily on technoscience to address environmental crisis. This is quite different from indigenous ways of knowing depicted here on the right. Of course, native worldviews are not homogeneous, but some shared traits include systems of governance grounded in principles of community and collectivity, interconnected and relational understandings of the social world and our place in it, importance of kinship, non-human, and land-based understandings of history that embrace duality or both-and thinking. Here, approaches to climate change are tied to healing the land and our relationship to it, and ending capitalism's continual destruction and domination of our earth. So Maya Henderson and I examined several climate-related documents in Seattle and identified 3 colonial logics that operate through climate mitigation to maintain Seattle's settler colonial project. First, Seattle employs individual behavioral control to reduce transportation emissions, most notably road pricing, so tolls, congestion fees, and parking fees, are being implemented as a key means of shifting transit behaviors towards electric transit or walking. The idea here is that the city can manage behavior in an objective and apolitical manner that works the same across different geographies and communities. Yet the reality is that fees disproportionately impact lower income communities, and alternative transit choices are limited in many lower income parts of the city. The idea of efficiency also dominates local action on climate in Seattle. Specifically, a focus on energy efficiency programs is rooted in the idea of economic and environmental win-wins. This includes allowing additional building height for developers who implement green building standards and incentives for homeowners to install electric heat pumps. As the city states, this helps the customer, quote, save energy and save money, end quote. Linked to what Dr. Long said earlier, this shows how settler logics are always anchored in an economic rather than an ethical or moral reason to implement climate action. And third, we find universalism in the form of leadership is another colonial logic found across the documents we analyzed. Specifically, Seattle has been advancing their desired reputation as, quote, America's most climate-friendly city, end quote. Yet this framework erases difference, specificity, and complexity of various communities and contexts. It also means Seattle seeks to export universal tactics that center economic growth as they leave untouched the foundational causes of the climate crisis. It centers capitalist status quo, indicating that Seattle, its residents, and everyone can simply own, use, and commodify better to achieve a climate solution, foreclosing other pathways and possibilities that center community and broader political change. We would argue that the implications of this colonial logic are twofold, the first of which you might be familiar with from living in the region. Seattle's approach is deeply rooted in an overarching priority to electrify everything. Actually, this is becoming national and even global, to achieve carbon neutrality. As you probably know, hydropower is an essential part of that carbon neutral strategy. But this approach fails to acknowledge the ongoing legal dispute between the Upper Skagit tribes and the city of Seattle regarding the ways that the dams have decimated sacred sites, sacred lands, and damaged salmon populations of central importance to native tribes in the region. Some of the tribes claim that the city is engaging in, quote, greenwashing, while the city claims that, quote, from a carbon perspective, end quote, the dams are good for everybody. So we've got greenwashing versus this carbon perspective. I should note an agreement, I just read this last week when updating this talk, was just reached between the tribes and the city regarding adding some fish passages. Of course, it has yet to be seen how and on what time frame this will be implemented. And as Nino Maltos of the Sauk Seattle Indian Tribe says, it's a good first step. So without broader recognition of the direct harm, past and present, to Indigenous groups that these hydro jams does, Seattle's mindset reasserts settler futures at the continued expense of Indigenous sovereignty and futures. And then second, where Maya and I are currently sort of putting our thinking in a paper we're working on, is how these colonial logics are tied to who belongs. We argue through these approaches to climate governance, it is the good green settler that is prioritized in Seattle's environmental policy. That is climate conscious settlers, a population that is predominantly represented in Seattle by tech workers who are relieved of any guilt regarding gentrification and forced displacement because of their good green lifestyles. New residents are welcomed into neighborhoods with light rail, streetcars, walkable streets, and carbon neutral events at Climate Pledge Arena, while lower income communities of color and urban native populations are increasingly forced out of the city through gentrification. But again, we don't want to stop here. We don't want to be all doom and gloom. We want to reinforce this. As Josh previously mentioned, we are not suggesting that any and all actions to address the climate crisis are inherently bad. Policies and programs on both mitigation and adaptation must be put in place to address this crisis. But we join a growing number of activists and scholars who believe we must confront colonial underpinnings of most climate action. We have to acknowledge and change this hard reality in order to achieve climate justice. So to that end, we want to highlight the radical world-making possibilities that lie within urban spaces, even settler colonial ones. In Seattle, for example, Matasta Talks, Got Green, Puget Sound Sage, Front and Centered, and even 350 Seattle are climate justice organizations uplifting the needs and voices of Indigenous, Black, Brown, and queer communities in order to promote and create real climate justice. Their goals for alternative transportation center around affordable, expansive public transportation, rather than high-tech, individualized transit. And their goals for carbon reduction are never disconnected from their efforts around a living wage and affordable or even universal housing. Cities are Indigenous lands and are prominent sites for addressing the climate crisis. And these organizations are seeking transformative actions beyond what the city is currently enacting. Our scale here, scalar jump, at a larger scale, we can consider and implement the Red Nations Red Deal. This plan divests from the carceral state and colonial borders, invests in social housing, education, healthcare, while healing relationships to land, water, and the non-human. This requires active decolonial mindsets, including efforts to return lands to Indigenous management and care. I just want to show a 3-minute video that allows a representative from the Red Nation to speak about this. It'll be about 3 minutes, and then I just have a quick wrap up. So if I can operate Josh's computer, this will go smoothly. I believe in you. Yeah, so definitely a focus on these structural root causes, causes that cause other problems. These are powerful ideas that point out how we have, as she says, fallen out of right relation with the earth. And they challenge us to end imperialism and capitalism as a first and central part of climate action or climate justice. Climate reparations are also relevant. These would include things like public finance of global climate infrastructures by the richest countries, debt relief for poor countries, ending tax havens for rich and powerful, divesting from fossil fuels to invest in Black and Indigenous communities, and bolstering more democratic decision-making processes. Josh and I want to end by recognizing that all the ideas that we have discussed here have long traditions in Indigenous, Black, female, and queer organizing. Many scholars have also been involved in the development of this way of understanding the intersections of climate change and coloniality. Lastly, much of this thinking is captured in a brand new book that we just had come out with UGA Press called Urban Climate Justice Theory, Praxis, Resistance. We're really, the essays in here are phenomenal. They really capture, if you liked this talk, this book is for you. And I would be remiss if I did not note and point out that your own Dr. Anthony Lavinda is both an editor of the book and a contributor to 2 chapters. So thank you so much. I guess we can take questions, comments.
Should we sit for questions? Is that
Yeah.
I guess up here.
If folks have questions, we could do sort of an informal Q&A, or if you want, I can pass the mic around. I don't know if people are more comfortable just speaking up without a microphone, I imagine, but if you speak loud enough, I think the camera will. Any questions for Jen or Josh? I can go first. Okay, I'll go first. We don't have to last question, but I guess one thing that always comes up when I think about like climate solutions, right? We think about like the technocentric kind of approaches, right? We think about solar panels, we think about all kinds of renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, geoengineering, who knows, right? And it seems like, a lot of focus is on critiquing those solutions, but it's not necessarily because of the technology itself, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Great point.
Right, and I was wondering if you all could elaborate a little bit on that, because there is in Seattle, there is a lot of technical solutions being put forward, but there's something else wrong with it, right? The issue isn't just the technology, right? It's the broader. Anyways, so that's just my observation.
I would just say, I think we both agree with you. It's not, so just to reiterate, I agree that on their own, solar panels or these kinds of things are not bad. Why they are bad in this context is complex and nuanced. Do you want to try to start?
I mean, it sort of depends on the motivations for this. Is it to create sort of just climate solution, or is this done to make money? Yeah. Is this the kind of thing is there, every time we talk about new kind of technological innovation that can address climate change, maybe it's great, but there's two problems we worry about. Who owns it? Why do they own it? Why is this getting funded? And what are the sort of the externalities, I guess, is one term we could use, or sort of the injustices that it creates in their wake. Because some of these things are either dispossessing people from land, or gathering massive sums of money for a technological solution to something that isn't really needed. It's fancy, it's pretty, it's shiny, but we could use that same amount of funding for so much more mitigation, or some very simple things like changing patterns of consumption, working on more down to the earth ways of carbon sequestration and back to the land, and not to mention land back kind of situations where we put people back in places where they want to be in order to advance solutions that are more labor intensive, but not necessarily technologically innovative. I'm talking a lot about agricultural production, for instance. I could go on and on about this. Actually, we could talk a lot about agricultural systems and other energy production systems that produce a lot of wonderful things, but there's not a lot of profit in them, and it also requires more labor than energy. Neither one of those things is profitable, right? And so profit tends to be the main driving force.
Yeah, I need a notepad so I can jot my thoughts down. But I remember one of the two that you spurred. But it's also for me, especially the context I work in. I'm working in neighborhoods, cities, local communities. It's also about accessibility. So you all are probably very familiar. The light rail in Seattle is awesome. It's awesome. It's totally reducing emissions. But what's happening around the light rail? Everything's getting more expensive. So only wealthier people can access those houses and condos. I mean, I was down at one of the South Seattle stations a year or two ago. And there was a house for sale, and I put it in my phone, and it was over $1 million. It's a single resident house. It was beautiful, it was lovely, but I think $1 million to be within walking distance of the light rail. Oh, thank you, Anthony. Sure. And then there was some other point that'll probably come to me later about the technology. And it's just about, just the massive amounts of money. I mean, we were talking yesterday at some point about imagine if you invested in putting solar panels on people's homes instead of rockets to space. Yeah. I'm sorry. That's the light rail is the obvious one I always write about, and the rocket to space. Right. What could Bezos and Branson have done on solar panel installation with that money? And how much carbon did they put in the air? It's bonkers.
And whose land are we taking for solar panel and solar farms or wind farms? I mean, who are we displacing for this, right? Yeah. It's never wealthy and white individuals that end up getting screwed in those deals. But there's also something else that's just a broad view of this. We're creating some of the greenest, cleanest, most beautiful cities. Seattle beautiful, right? And it is very climate friendly. I come from Austin. It's a very strong climate action plan. But it's these cities that are created only for those who can afford it. And we don't want to create some kind of segregated landscape of haves and have-nots, not just in the cities we live, but in the world we're creating right now. And we write about climate apartheid.
Three of us have a paper on that.
Where, I'm not so worried about sort of this human species surviving climate change. I'm more worried about a few climate haves being able to control where our planetary system goes so that only a few people emerge. And they're the ones that are insulated from the worst problems with climate change, while everyone else is suffering, being shut out because of migration issues, because of rising sea levels, I could go on a long rant about this, and this increasing division we have, not just in our cities, but again, on our planet, because of the climate crisis.
Very important and complicated question and answer. It's a really important question.
Is like switching over to like all electric even sustainable? Because we're still taking power from places like I don't.
As someone who lives in Georgia, that is primarily a fossil fuel. I mean, at least up here it is hydropower. It's got this really awful issue with the native lands. But I mean, I don't understand this push to electrify everything when there's not a clear and simultaneous discussion about decarbonizing the electric grid. I mean, there are incentives to go electric in Georgia, but Georgia is the vast majority fossil fuel and actually nuclear. We have one of the biggest like proportions of nuclear power from Georgia Power. And I'm like, you're just shifting. It's like a shell game to me. I cannot wrap my brain around electrify everything, especially in places that don't have alternative low carbon or no carbon electricity. I don't know. What do they do in Texas? It's old.
Well, I mean, we have a ton of wind power. We have a ton of solar
It's a good
power.
point, yeah.
And we're not getting the message out that actually it's actually reducing the cost on the average consumer because we have so much renewable energy that's cheaper than fossil fuel extraction. There's another point I was going to make here with that. Yeah, I totally dropped it while you were talking. It was so good. But I think we could maybe do this if we weren't so focused on the fact that our economic model that we are in necessitates further growth. So if we apply the principles of deep growth or A growth, then maybe we wouldn't need quite as much electricity. We wouldn't consume as much. But there are no ways of investing and making money out of deep growth. At least, actually, there's economists who are saying that there are right now, and so maybe we should start listening to them. But in the United States, saying like, oh, well, we don't need any more electricity because we're going to stop using as much electricity. Every single model is that we're
and just wait till people's 401ks go down because they're invested in energy. I mean, so it's so multi-layered and complicated.
Yeah. It was have this path dependency in capitalism, right? And so we go into further debt, and so we have to have more growth to pay off the debt. There's a lot of these like cyclical reinforcing problems that we're facing right now.
Hi. So Amita and I are in a climate justice program here with Shangela Joshi, and we've actually been reading a lot of the authors you're saying. And we have seminar discussions on the authors, and we have these conversations in circles for hours. And I totally agree with everything you put forth here that we can't solve a problem capitalism and colonialism made with more capitalism and colonialism. But the issue we keep running into is all these authors have really great critiques of the current system and really great ideas of where to move next. But it feels like the systems we're currently living in won't let us truly change them or implement them. And so I'm interested in this type of work and in climate policy, and I don't think you have the answer to this, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. How do we begin to change this system that doesn't want us to change it?
I mean, there's a bazillion answers, none of which are adequate. But I tend to go back to tropes or examples. But I mean, can you imagine if, especially where we live in red states, that my state's not that red. I don't think yours is either.
In terms of the population?
Yeah, the
or
actual.
The governors.
Well, no, the people, the residents. We're pretty purpley states. I mean, Georgia just sent y'all 2 Democratic senators, and you are welcome. I voted 9,000 times because there is a runoff, and then a runoff to the runoff, and then you have to get over 50. So you are welcome. And half of that was during a pandemic in long lines. But imagine if we were, so this is what I say, and this is what I think, this is what I think they're saying when they're talking about basic structural changes. What if we fixed electoral politics?
Yeah.
If you look at the country as a whole, right? And it is more liberal, more democratic, probably more willing to do things, probably more willing to redistribute wealth or invest wealth in these technological solutions more equitably. But our electoral politics, which nobody thinks of as climate policy, but what if we started to think about electoral politics as climate policy? I'm in a city of 130,000 people, the vast majority always vote Democrat, but all of our state and federal representatives, except for one, are Republicans because of the way we've been drawn into rural districts and other districts. Our local government's pretty blue, but actually our red state government put some clampdowns and actually redrew, during people's terms as county commissioners, redrew them out of their seats and were able to flip a couple of our seats that were from liberal to very conservative. So how do you get anything done in that environment? I mean, so I don't know if to me that's a tangible solution, is we could start working on democracy. and electoral politics. So do you have better ideas?
No, I don't know, but I have more.
Good.
That's the thing is that it takes this multi-pronged attack and approach to this because we could be talking about electoral politics, we could be talking about representation, and the other side of this, we also have massive voter suppression right now.
Yeah.
I mean, the majority of the United States is in favor of taking action on climate change. And as I say that, when I say the majority of the United States, I'm still thinking we get stuck in this viewpoint of just the US. Now, there's pros and cons to that because on the one hand, US does lead so much because of its power, because of the size of its economy, because of its political influence, sure. There's plenty of spaces of resistance out there outside of a US context
absolutely.
or a Western context or a Eurocentric context. And so multiple spaces coming together where you can actually see alternative models. You don't get as much attention because of the horrendousness of what we see in our everyday viewpoint right here in the United States and in some other countries. But I wouldn't give up hope because not only are there scalar, in terms of like there are small spaces, there are big places outside of the United States where we can see these models enacted. But also there's so many different points of attack to help dismantle these systems that it's okay to say that, oh, that's a minor action, or that's a minor action, okay, that's a small. All these things become significant over time as you start acting on and take these strategies for like actually tackling what is arguably the biggest existential crisis that we face as a species.
I run into that problem in my classes.
Oh yeah, it's a great question.
Everyone's like, we really try to not just do the critique and like what's wrong, but you run up against it is hard. I mean, it's hard to imagine outside of a system that's so hegemonic and dominant. Like it's very hard to imagine outside of it when you're deeply in it. But good job trying.
I also recognize that a lot of authors we don't know.
Yes.
And that's
Fair enough. Yeah. It's a really great question. Thanks for
And we often
that.
talk about sitting with our discomfort, like what is our own role in this? What is our own personal consumption? How do we flew here, right? Like, and how do we take on that guilt? How do we, and then how do we advocate for ways so we can have an alternative to that, right? Because sometimes those alternatives don't exist. I mean, taking a train from Texas to here is a multi-day, very complicated journey. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah, sure.
Right? I really appreciate you asking because that was a tough
That's
question.
good.
And people sometimes will like shy down, oh, I shouldn't ask this question, maybe we'll take them off and we won't be able to answer. Those are the ones we like because we grapple with these all the time. And sometimes our answer is, I don't know. I think it's good that you're asking them.
It's a great question. I'm smart. I know you're really smart.
I have a weird question. I'm not sure how to ask it, but it kind of you guys just mentioned about like hope and stuff too, and the whole like how do we work in a system that like, or how do we imagine a new future when we're kind of stuck in the system? And I'm a big proponent of like social imagination, like trying to see different things. And so my question is mostly just kind of a bunch of buzzwords and your thoughts on it. So like social imagination. But I was curious if you all are familiar with solar punk. It's a term that I just learned about in the last like year, and then also more recently I learned about I had known about Afrofuturism, but then I learned about indigenous futurism, which I kind of came to a thing like solar punk. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the best way for like speculative fiction about how to build a better world and like finding examples that exist right now. And then I learned about indigenous futurism, and I kind of came into a complex of, oh, maybe solar punk is like the whitewashed bird, like I don't know, just a thing, or like maybe it's inclusive and stuff, and I don't know.
I cannot remember her name, but I just spent a couple days with Micah from Solar Punk. She's the lead artist who's like bringing all these people together for Solar Punk. We had her to our campus.
Oh, that's awesome.
She was incredible talking. I guess I never really sat down and talked about the different ways that imagining a future empowers different people in different walks of life, right? Because we all come at this problem differently with our own idiosyncrasies or our own traumas. And whether it's Afrofuturism, cyberpunk, anything where you have to imagine a future because you have to imagine a future before you start to build it, right? So people are like, oh, cli-fi is kind of silly. No, it is absolutely not. These are really important things to imagine our future and work our way through it. So I got really excited. I'll find her name because like her work is amazing.
That'd be awesome.
I'm not super familiar with solar punk, so y'all have something to tell me about. I'm familiar with Afrofuturism. Yeah, I think that's really important. I mean, all I can say is yes, you're totally right on, and I would love to develop those skills and mindsets and just ways of thinking and being more. I don't know. I mean, we're all like pulled in a zillion directions, but I suspect that. I mean, it's very hard for me to. That was a big recording. to like overstate like what it is like to just do this work on, on the kind of campus I work on. I mean, it's just, like Anthony's been showing me around, and I'm just like, oh my gosh, like y'all, like everyone's doing cool justice, this, that, and I have to be very careful in my classroom. Yeah. This book, I was like, had to go to our PR person and say, could you just like write a little blurb for the one little college column, and it's a huge accomplishment at UGA Press. It's actually UGA Press. So, but I need to not let that distract me from checking out from that and remembering that I can engage these other ways of thinking and imagining and being. So that I would like to talk about that after.
But it's a reminder that that's another one of those points of attack, right? Because the voice, especially at public universities in red states, academia is being attacked right now. Like in the state of Texas, they're trying to pass a law right now to end tenure. In Florida, they're trying to completely remove critical race theory from the curriculum. And so like, actually, just the act of coming here and hanging out with y'all is encouraging. We needed this, okay? Can I give you like a really short anecdote? I'll try to do it all the time. Okay, so I wanted to show you this. So we've been working on a land acknowledgement, an actionable land acknowledgement agreement at my university, and faculty were in favor of it. Students are in favor of it. It passed all the way through the university governance system, and it got to even the president was like, "This is great. I love this. This is what we're about. This is the message of this university." It gets to the board of trustees, and we had mentioned something about how in Texas, because so much land was taken away from Native populations in Texas, and brutally so if you know anything about the early 1900s in Texas. And one of the things we talked about was how much Comanche land was taken away from early German settlers. And the board of trustees actually came out and said, oh my God, this is being recorded.
I know.
Well, I think just on that side.
Yeah. No, it's fine. A couple of the board of trustees were like, well, but the Millersback treaty is famous for being a long-lasting, peaceful treaty that benefited the Comanches and the German settlers. And we're like, where did you hear that? Oh, we see the statue, and we've seen the statue's bullshit. Like, yes, did they sit down and sign a treaty? Yes, but they were like, the equivalent to like $1,000 to today to take over 3 million acres, taken by a dominant population who walked in and said, you have to sign this. The Comanches gained nothing out of this, except for a pause in attacks from the Texas Rangers and from the American military. So it's like, this is accepted as history. It's been ingrained so much, whether it's statues or historical plaques that you see, that this is used as evidence against the arguments we're making for climate justice, right? So it's just a small thing, but, right? Like how we actually define what the histories and the facts are still so whitewashed that it's hard to go back and uncover the documents exist. The native population still exists and still tell stories. Yeah, and so you still have native Comanche coming to, and actually to prefer the term Comanche, but they come to campus and they say, no, we can tell you the history. Yeah. We fucking lived it. Yeah. They made statues. We didn't make the statues, so there is a history that is fixed.
Yeah. So then how do you fight against fantasy, against people's values? I mean, especially in opposition to the indigenous values.
Well, I mean, again, the opposite sort of situation that I have in my campus, I mean, I'm teaching 300-person classes, and I was just saying to Anthony and Josh and Buck earlier, I mean, I just teach them what colonization was in the first instance, and I think they understand it a little bit, but I mean, I'm really trying to go through it and how it's still a historical present. And so that's one small example. Is I see that 300-person class, it's called Introduction to Human Geography. I teach it most semesters. I see that as just, if they just had to hear it, and even had to pick the right answer on the multiple choice test about like redlining or colonization or indigenous this or that, like removal, or, I feel like at least they've had to encounter it, and then I force them to, if they wanted their 2 points out of the 100, to pick the right answer. But that's a small thing too. But I mean, and it varies on your context as well. But it's very hard. I mean, I don't think people talk enough about, you mentioned it, about the role of religion in these philosophies. It's a hard thing to talk about because it's important to people and it's complicated.
And the appropriation of religion, economics, American freedom,
yes,
patriotism, all these things blended together. And the thing is, like, if you separate all these things out and you talk about the histories of them, students will start to listen and learn. And I hate to say, oh, education is the key, but it's true. And it's one of the reasons that education is under attack. Because if you talk about the history of capitalism, the history of colonialism, the history of religion, and talk about these things on a spectrum, right? Like, so this isn't something controversial, but capitalism exists on a spectrum. And you talk about how capitalism has evolved over time when it was like really much closer to what we might recognize as socialism. And it's creeped ever so, well, there was a big jump in the 80s. We keep going more towards this neoliberalist, very highly unregulated, for-profit, extremely market-driven capitalism with no checks and balances. And if you get, like, sometimes just talking to the students who are, because you get students who are like very rah-rah, capitalism is the greatest thing, it's capitalism, Jesus, and guns, and that's what gets us here, right? You're like, okay, let's separate all these things out. First of all, let's talk about how those things got together. But let's separate them out, and we'll come back to how they blended together later, and talk about how each of these got ramped up over time, and how we've been slowly boiling in the water, and how we've gotten to the point where we are today, where we just accept some of these things as fact, and we need to go back and reconsider these things and intervene and disrupt. It's not. I hope that's a satisfying answer, because I struggle with that too. Like, how do you deal with people who live in a very different reality than you because of the news they watch, or the books they read, or their upbringing, or whatever it is? It's a challenge. Listening, because you also have to listen. You can't just tell them. Like, you have to understand where people are coming from.
Absolutely.
It's hard. It takes patience, damn it. It's hard.
Yeah, I mean, my whole mother's side of the family has been in oil and gas for generations, and you can understand. Like, I mean, they've done the hard work to produce cheap electricity for us, and now everyone's like, "You're terrible, and fossil fuels are terrible," and that's just not going to work. There has to be some way to say acknowledge and like say thank you. You did do this. Now we know it's destroying the planet and civilization. Thank you so much. Can we like give you a nice retirement, or can we transition you to a new job instead of demonizing that field? I mean, they're my uncles. They're human beings, and they work their asses off in these oil fields. It's not pleasant. I would not want to do that. And it's very.
It's difficult. Do you cut off your family?
You're
Do you
from
cut off your
Texas.
friends? Yeah. One
Yeah.
of my best friends is the oil industry, and by staying close to him and talking through these things, we actually have conversations about decarbonizing. And it would have never happened if they're like, "Oh man, fuck, I'm not talking to you. You work in the oil field," and this person's actually thinking of leaving now. And then they're like, I don't think these would have happened if we just hadn't talked and listened to each other. And because we also have to remember that some of the worst forms of fossil fuel extraction, including on native lands, are some of the only jobs that people can get, whether we're talking about Appalachia, whether we're talking about Navajo Nation, whether we're talking about the oil fields of the Permian Basin. Sometimes the only way to put a roof on your head and have a family, if that's your goal, is to get a job in that. And so it's complicated. Right? We have to acknowledge all those things together. Yeah.
We want to come take your classes. That would help us too.
Yeah.
Residency program. Yeah, please.
So kind of going back to when we were talking about Seattle, I'm just kind of curious how they can really like offset their carbon emissions and go net neutral with the whole electric thing if they're drawing on the electrical grid, which is mostly coal power. I mean, I know we use some hydropower in Washington State, but I'm just curious, like, how do they say, like, oh, we're net neutral if they're still using those emissions? Like, how do they get around that?
So these get complicated. Anthony might know better than me, but so they do have a large percentage that is hydropower, so that is truly carbon neutral. Then they buy carbon offsets. That's my understanding. And then they do what's it called? Efficiency conservation program. So like they'll spend money to like weatherize your windows and doors, so then you use less electricity, then they have to offset less. But the offsets, as you probably know, especially in these climate classes, like they're deeply problematic. Like, what does it mean to like go preserve forests in Central America, or what does it mean to give a woman in India a new stove? I mean, these are the kind of things that happen. They're like they're like that's what it is. Some of it, and some of it we don't know what it is. Maya Henderson has tried to figure out what carbon offset Seattle is buying, and she has not been able to figure it out yet. She can't figure out what is the project that's being done. She can
Lack of transparency about an already intransparent process. That's so hard, yeah.
And again, it's awful to like ding Seattle, who does have really low carbon energy, but I mean, how do you just ignore this like, tribal situation? How do you ignore that? And that quote is from a video, from a carbon perspective, this DM is best for everybody. I tried to find the video to show you all, but I couldn't find that exact clip in time for today, but it's hard stuff. Great questions, y'all. This is fun.
Hey, thank y'all for being here on a Friday.
Thank you. This is
Seriously.
really fun. Y'all are awesome.
It's hard to get people out on a Friday.
On a
so we
beautiful
really,
day.
truly appreciate it.
Yeah.
This early arrival of spring and summer is due to the increased greenhouse gas concentration. Probably, certainly.
But it sure is lovely.
It is lovely. It is lovely. Things are getting like cooler and wetter in Georgia, so come visit us.
Oh, yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other final questions? We can feel free to do some more informal
Yeah.
socialization afterwards,
Yep.
but maybe just so that we can let the media folks be done. We can close now and just let's end with a round of applause for everybody, including our speakers.